All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the first On the Mind podcast solo blog. I'm Duncan from the On the Mind podcast, and we're going to be doing something. This is a little bit of a new format for us. Austin and Bryce are going to be doing their own solo blogs here, hopefully pretty soon. But as far as I know, this is going to be the first going up on the YouTube channel. So thank you for joining me, and just in advance, I do apologize for the what I'm sure is going to be lackluster video quality. Unfortunately, I'm recording this on the webcam of my rather outdated laptop, so again, I apologize for any technical issues that may arise from that. Tonight's topic, we're going to be looking at Donald Trump's 100-day plan, point by point. Specifically, what we're going to be looking at are the policies that he claims he is going to pursue during his first day in office. By nature, these are going to be executive policies rather than legislative policies. Except for one that we're going to get to in a minute here. Yeah, let's just jump into this and kind of see how we do. So, I'm going to, just so you know, I am going to post a link down in the description below so that you can check out what I'm reading and read along with me as I go. And we are going to start with the actual policies. I'm going to skip the introductory paragraph because, quite frankly, there just isn't anything of any real substance in there. So, starting with point 1, and this is in the area of eliminating government corruption. First, propose a constitutional amendment to impose term limits on all members of Congress. And this is really the most egregious part of this section, not so much because I disagree with it. I do actually disagree with it. I do think that term limits somewhat take the onus off of the electorate to elect and to re-elect their own representatives, and that they punish both good and poor representatives roughly equally. So I do have some philosophical issues with it. The big problem I have is that this is in what should be the executive section of Donald Trump's 100-day plan, and it is in fact a legislative process. This isn't something he can just propose. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt on this one and say that he's using this as a heuristic example for having somebody propose it for him who's an ally in the Congress. I can see that working out, but again, it just isn't worded the way that it actually should be. So moving on from that, we're going to give him the benefit of the doubt for point 1. And again, I realize that a lot of the American people do actually agree with the idea of term limits for legislators. I just happen not to, so maybe you agree with that, maybe you don't. Put your thoughts in the comment section below, and we'll kind of get a debate going here. So moving on to point number 2. Second, a hiring freeze on all federal employees to reduce federal workforce through attrition, exempting military, public safety, and public health. Now, this one actually does kind of line up with some of the things that Trump has said, and it's one of the very few things that on this list that seems fiscally responsible to me. Governments do have massive bureaucracies, and the bureaucracies account for a huge portion of the spending. Regrettably, I don't see how this works out with his plan, because of course he has repeatedly said that he's going to effectively increase spending while reducing tax revenue, which isn't something that's fiscally responsible. No fiscal conservative, which I count myself as one, would ever endorse such a plan. And interestingly, Alan Greenspan, sort of the ultimate fiscal conservative since Milton Friedman died, came out when he was discussing this election and effectively said that Donald Trump did not in any way represent an actual conservative Republican. So I do have a lot of issues with this approach, because it seems like what he's saying is that he is going to increase spending, which by necessity, unless you're just going to put more money into the same places, is going to actually require increased federal employees. And several of Donald Trump's plans do require an increase in federal workforce, not the least of which being his, of course, deportation squads. We'll probably get back into that at another point. But, let's just keep in mind that he's said a lot of things that, by their necessity, imply that there is going to be some kind of increase in federal workforce under the Trump administration. This would seem a little bit incongruous with that, but again, let's give him the benefit of the doubt and say he's talking about eliminating redundancies in federal bureaucracies. I noticed that the first 2 points I already have to give him benefit of the doubt, and I think I'm going to get tired of that very quickly. But the night is young, so let's work with him a little. Third, a requirement that every new federal regulation, that for every new federal regulation, 2 existing regulations must be eliminated. Again, this is something I agree with in spirit, but in practice it becomes very difficult because not all regulations are created equal. Just assigning a numeric quota to the number of regulations that you're going to have doesn't really say anything about the type of regulations that are going to get cut. I mean, for example, let's say you introduce a new environmental regulation. Does that mean that you are then going to cut, say, 2 environmental regulations, or does that mean you're then going to cut, say, 2 regulations from anywhere else in the government's sphere of influence on business in the private sector? This doesn't really explain it as clearly as it needs to be explained, and I think that in order for this to work in any substantive way, there really does need to be a very clear framework for what kind of regulations are involved. Does the introduction of 1 regulation require the elimination of 2 in the same basic field? Is it just across the board? We need specifics on stuff like this, or it just can never work, and it becomes an ad hoc program that just lacks direction. So I think there are a lot of problems with this. Again, in spirit, I agree with it, but it really needs a much more cement and concrete, definition. Let's define what this policy is, and then proceed to evaluate it from there. As it is, it could be great, it could be terrible, it could be completely neutral. We don't know. So, moving on to the next. 4th point. A 5-year ban on White House and congressional officials becoming lobbyists after they leave government service. This and the other points that he makes about lobbyists and such, I do more or less agree with. I don't necessarily think there needs to be federal intervention to do this. But if it has become that big of a problem in Washington, and I think most American voters think that it has, this isn't something I'm super against or super for. I think Trump is more or less sort of representing the views of his constituents in this, which is ultimately what a president is supposed to do. So, okay, I'll give you points for this one. Basically the same with the next one. Lifetime ban on White House officials lobbying on behalf of a foreign government. I suppose the one exception I would think of to that is if they move to a foreign country and then, lobby within that foreign government. Again, I'm just sort of being pedantic on that one. There's really no chance of that really occurring, and it wouldn't be a federal issue if it did, so long as that was contained exclusively within another country. So, there is an exception to that rule, but it doesn't really count that much. Now, the next point in this is actually well taken, I have to admit. The 6th and final point in his essentially corruption section here is a complete ban on foreign lobbyists raising money for American elections. I think this is something that definitely is beneficial. Again, this isn't something we should have to make a federal law about. It should simply be common sense, but if it isn't, and this is actually becoming a fairly common occurrence, then let's go ahead and nip that in the bud. Okay, Trump, I'll give you some points. Credit where credit's due. You get this one, all right? So, overall, government corruption issues, neutral to beneficial. I'm going to say he did pretty well on this one, not an insane set of policy ideas. In my opinion, this was definitely the best section of this 100-day plan as far as his first day in office goes. So now let's move on to the crazy stuff, because that's what you're all here for, let's be honest. And the next section that we will address is protecting American workers, something that Donald Trump has absolutely no clue how to do, and this is mostly economic policies that he does not understand sufficiently to enact. Just my opinion on that one, but we'll get into it as we go. So, first point. I will announce my intention to renegotiate NAFTA or withdraw from the deal under Article 2205. This flies in the face of a lot of basic economic common sense and Donald Trump's own policies. For one thing, all 3 nations that are in the NAFTA Pact do rely on it as part of their economic foundation. And what's interesting is that one of those nations is Mexico. Now, you can talk about abrogating the NAFTA treaty. I don't think it's a good idea whatsoever. Those of you who listen to the podcast on a regular basis know my views on free trade and free markets. I do think they're generally beneficial. and that in the long run they do generally strengthen economies. Here's my issue. Trump's also taken a very hard line on illegal immigration from Mexico, and frankly, as bad as I think the hit to the United States economy would be if we did abrogate the NAFTA treaty, the damage to the Mexican economy would be significantly worse. And under those circumstances, my problem with Trump's internal logic is that I fail to see how he thinks that that is not going to create a massive incentive for illegal immigration to occur from Mexico northward. Because again, if you destroy the Mexican economy, you effectively destroy the incentive for people to stay in Mexico. And even though the U.S. economy probably would not be in as good a shape as it is right now under those circumstances, it would still, because of the fact it's a more mature economy, because of the fact it's more diversified, simply because of the fact that it is inherently a somewhat wealthier economy, we would still be in better shape than Mexico after the abrogation of the NAFTA treaty. So, again, this is something where Trump's policies sort of run in conflict to each other, and I'm really hoping he doesn't abrogate the NAFTA treaty because, quite frankly, I don't think any of us want to go there on either the immigration standpoint or on the foreign policy positions or simply the economic ramifications of that move. I don't think that's something any of us really want to see. So, continuing. Second, I will announce our withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. My arguments about this are roughly the same as they are with NAFTA. Again, it is excluding us from the global economic community. And this is something that we have to consider going into the future. Japan and Australia, two countries that are integral parts of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, are currently pursuing their own free trade agreements outside of the TPP. I think we do have a lot of concerns with this because, quite frankly, if those continued trade agreements go through, if China continues to pursue trade agreements within its own sphere of influence, and Donald Trump cuts us off from international trade, there really is a possibility that 10 years from now, 15 years from now, we could be essentially cut off as one of the large import-export companies or countries in the world. A position that we enjoy right now and that we enjoy the benefits of right now. So I do think that the long-term ramifications of this are very negative. I think that if NAFTA is abrogated and the TPP is backed away from, and unfortunately right now I don't see a good way for the TPP to proceed forward under the Trump administration, America's not going to get into it as far as I can see. I think if both of them, if the TPP doesn't come to pass and NAFTA is abrogated, the compounding effects from that can be very negative, extrapolated out over time. So, again, basically the same argument with that one. Third, I will direct my Secretary of the Treasury to label China a currency manipulator. Okay, I am going to go to my kitchen, pull out a cast iron skillet, and inform it that it's made of iron. I'm sorry, labeling China a currency manipulator effectively does nothing. I'll link in the description below to a very, very good article that was compiled by Foreign Policy Magazine during the Obama-Romney election of 2012. It explains very neatly what labeling China a currency manipulator actually means, and I'll give you a hint, it doesn't mean a whole heck of a lot. Essentially, once we've labeled a country as a currency manipulator, we can enter into negotiations regarding how we're going to solve that problem, something that we've already done with China to very little avail. And one thing I will remind all of you, yes, China is the worst offender, but the reality is that all modern countries manipulate their currency to some degree, including us. Anyone who thinks the United States does not manipulate our currency, quantitative easing. Look up quantitative easing. It is a form of currency manipulation, albeit a much more mild form than that pursued by the Chinese, and certainly we do not pursue it to the same kind of degree. The Chinese have also, we learned in the last quarter of about 2015, when the commodities crash occurred, the Chinese are also responsible for simply cooking their books, which is, again, one of the problems with the state owning a significant stake in, companies that actually do pursue business abroad. It's one of the inherent dangers of state capitalism, in my opinion, but that's really neither here nor there. The point is that currency manipulation, to one degree or another, does occur in most modern nation states. So labeling them as a currency manipulator, again, I'm going to go tell my cast iron skillet that it's made of iron. I'm sure it will be horrifically hurt. And moving on. I will direct the Secretary of Commerce and U.S. Trade Representatives to identify all foreign trading abuses that unfairly impact American workers and direct them to use every tool under American and international law to end those abuses immediately. Again, this is one of those things that sounds great on paper, and in spirit, I can kind of get behind it. The reality is far different, however. International trade law is an incredibly complex thing, and it takes years for these cases to work their way through the courts. The reality is that if Donald Trump did that on day number one, ordered for his subordinates to go out and identify all of those cases and then bring suit through proper legal channels, the reality is that nothing would get done for several years. Donald Trump would probably be out of office by the time anything actually got accomplished on that front. So is it something that can be useful? Sure. Given Trump's seemingly more short-term approach to American economic growth, I don't think it's something that's going to really fit in very well with his plans, and I don't think it's going to reap any benefit during his administration. So, not a bad idea, but again, I don't think it fits in very well with some of his other plans. Okay, fifth, I will lift the restrictions on the production of $50 trillion worth of job-producing American energy reserves, including shale oil, natural gas, and clean coal. Donald, buddy, I know you know this because I heard you mention this country on the campaign trail. I'll give you a hint. S-A... Okay, never mind. You're not getting it. It's Saudi Arabia. Okay. The current oil crisis that we are experiencing has absolutely nothing to do with American producers. It's because of a glut that was caused by the Saudi Arabians and that was exacerbated by the bringing back of Iran into the exporting market and by Venezuela dumping oil into the world market in an attempt to get revenue. Yes, this is all sort of a perfect storm, and yes, it has damaged, the world fossil fuel industry. But here's the problem. We do not want to be dependent on oil as an economic crutch right now. Look at Venezuela, look at Russia. Countries that are less diversified than us in terms of economics have typically not fared well in this new environment, mostly because the price of a barrel of oil has absolutely plummeted over the course of about the last year. So, yeah, this is not something we should be really pursuing as a long-term job creator. Now, he does mention some other things. Natural gas, very similar thing. American hydraulic fracturing has actually driven down the cost of natural gas overall. And, similar processes in Central Asia are probably going to continue that trend. And coal is just sort of an enigma to me as to what he thinks is going to occur with that, because we are not a net importer of coal. We're a net exporter of coal. And given the commodities prices at the moment, being a net exporter of coal is not particularly beneficial from an economic standpoint. Are there still companies that are making money on coal? Of course there are. But reopening the coal industry isn't really going to generate that many more jobs, especially considering that coal consumption has gone down significantly. In fact, in the U.S., between 2001 and 2015, coal production dropped by about 10%, while consumption dropped by about 13%. So in reality, we're actually, at this point, creating a surplus, and that's mostly for our export market. Like any other commodity, we do import some of it, but in terms of, and that's mostly as a shipping expedient, but as a net exporter or importer, we are a net exporter of coal in a very negative commodities climate right now. So is that something that is long-term sustainable in any way in terms of job growth or economic growth? I would argue no, because the world is moving away from coal. Even China is moving away from coal, which is the single largest user of it right now. So focusing on things that haven't been relevant in the energy sector in a very long time and are growing more and more irrelevant as time goes on, not really a paradigm for the future as far as I'm concerned. So I don't really know what Donald Trump was thinking with this one, other than several of his constituents live in areas where coal used to be a major economic driver. And again, the economic conditions in this country have changed significantly over the last half century, more so than they have in any other time in human history. And we have to, learn to live with that. It's simply a reality of the modern world. You can't have things back how they were 50 years ago. It just doesn't work anymore. So, moving on. Sixth, lift the Obama-Clinton roadblocks and allow vital energy and infrastructure projects like the Keystone Pipeline to move forward. This is actually kind of ironic because I think that this is going to create more jobs, at least in the short term, than pretty much all of his energy policy put together. Again, as long as the world remains in an oil glut with, price per barrel of crude considerably depressed, and as long as coal is actually going on a downward spiral in terms of consumption, I don't see energy jobs being created at anywhere near the rate Donald Trump seems to think they are going to occur. On the other hand, when you do something like this, when you build a pipeline, it does require labor. It's one of those things that objectively requires labor because there's a set project that needs to be completed by a set date, and you do have to have labor for that. The reality is, though, that labor may be temporary. A lot of that labor may be brought on or given overtime hours for this particular project, and afterwards it's not going to continue to work on that project, of course, once the project is completed. So this is kind of ironic in that it's probably going to create more jobs in the construction industry, at least as I said in the short term, as it will in the energy sector. Again, is this maybe beneficial to some small degree in the short term? Sure, but it's not some earth-shattering policy that's going to create jobs. Donald Trump just doesn't have one of those because there's really not much the federal government can do to force the creation of jobs. And that's one of the dirty little secrets of American politics, is that everyone talks about job creation, and the reality is that the federal government can only harbor an economic climate in which job creation is easier or more incentivized. There is no way for the federal government to create jobs except to hire federal employees. And again, that has to be paid for with tax revenue, which is actually typically taken from businesses and individuals, and that actually depresses the number of jobs that are created in the private sector. So, as a net creator of jobs, the federal government has very, very few aces up its sleeve. So, moving on to the seventh and final point with regards to protecting American workers. Cancel billions in payments to the UN climate change programs and use the money to fix America's water and environmental infrastructure. Okay, this one, again, I guess I kind of agree with, although for a very different reason than what Trump seems to think is a good idea here. I do think that at $20 trillion in debt, we probably do not need to be contributing anything to UN programs, beneficial though they may be, and again, Trump's probably coming at this from a very different angle than I am, being more or less a climate change denier, or at least someone who doesn't think it's particularly important. I'm coming at this purely from an economic standpoint. We are so fiscally irresponsible in this country at this point that we do not have the luxury of funding even very beneficial programs until we get our own house in order. And, unfortunately, I sound a little like Donald Trump at the moment, except, of course, his plan to increase spending while decreasing revenues is exactly the opposite of what you would expect for someone who's saying that. But be that as it may, I can kind of get behind this one just as, for two reasons. One, UN programs don't tend to be particularly effective. Some of them are. The World Health Organization, of course, has done a lot of great work with funding from countries like us. But the fact of the matter is, we need to get our own house in order to remain sustainable in the long term. And at $20 trillion in debt, we don't need to be contributing to these programs right now. I think we can make up those contributions later on. But again, prioritize. And countries have to prioritize this sort of thing. So that is sort of what it is. And it's a sad thing. It is that we may not be able to continue to be a leader in that area because of our own fiscal mistakes. But, we have to remedy those mistakes before they really sink us. So, the next thing that we have to move on to is, this is going to be fun. Security and rule of law. Donald Trump has made a lot of insane statements about this in the course of the campaign. Some of them fairly moderate, and then oftentimes he contradicts those with positions that are extreme. Unfortunately, we can only guess at what his actual positions are because he has never really told us. But let's go on what's on his first day agenda here. And the first point is a really interesting one, which is to cancel every unconstitutional executive action, memorandum, and order issued by President Obama. I am 100% behind this, as it is stated. I am not 100% behind Donald Trump's implementation of it, because it would seem to me that the way he states this would require him to bring a case against every single action that Barack Obama took as an executive order, and ride that case all the way to the Supreme Court, and then have it decide what is constitutional and what is unconstitutional. Donald, you're not the Supreme Court. You are not the legislature. You are the president. You are the head of the executive branch. Read the Constitution sometime, buddy. It tells you what your job is. I promise you. Really good job description. You have a lot of power, but you don't get to decide what's constitutional and what's unconstitutional. Now, he is correct in that he can cancel any executive action taken by Barack Obama with an opposite executive action. That is his prerogative as President of the United States in the post-Obama era. But phrasing it like this, I disagree with the way he words it, because it would seem to imply to some degree that he has, either the competence or the power to decide what is constitutional and what is not constitutional, which is a judicial privilege, not an executive privilege. So, moving on. Second, begin the process of selecting a replacement for Justice Scalia from the list of 20 that he has presented, etc., etc. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Okay, yeah, this is your job, Donald. You need to nominate someone to the Congress, to the Senate specifically, and actually have that person confirmed. I am a little sorry that Merrick Garland's not going to get his shot. Unlike a lot of more conservative-leaning people, I actually thought that Merrick Garland was eminently well qualified in terms of being ready to serve on the Supreme Court. I'm not particularly happy that someone who was that well qualified is not going to get his shot simply because of partisan politics, but it is what it is and we have to move on. So yeah, Donald Trump does need to fill this seat. Hopefully he'll pick someone who is relatively moderate. We can only hope, right? Moving on. Cancel all federal funding to sanctuary cities. This one's going to be fun, guys. Number one, Donald, give us a legal definition of what a sanctuary city is, because right now there isn't an agreed-upon legal definition. There's a colloquial definition, which is simply a city that refuses to take onto itself federal law enforcement authority in terms of dealing with immigrants who commit no other crimes other than being in this country illegally. If that's what you mean, please define it at the federal level and then proceed as follows. Just know that withdrawing all federal funding from a city simply because it does pursue this policy is going to result in a lot of problems, especially if you do it all at once. Unfortunately, a lot of cities do overspend and they do depend on federal dollars. And if that's phased out over time, I think it could actually be a beneficial thing from an economic perspective. On the other hand, if you simply cut off funding that's always been there all at once, there's no way for that to end well, unfortunately. So the one thing I would really look at this is, are you overreacting? Are you saying that because the city has one policy, we're going to cut off all of these programs and all of this funding that has always been there without any plan for replacing it or any plan for compensating for that? I do hope that's not what his plan is. Unfortunately, as it's spelled out here, it really does seem to be. One ironic thing I will bring up is that Donald Trump's going to be living in a city that he's cut off funding to, because Washington, D.C., unbeknownst to many, Washington, D.C. is in and of itself a sanctuary city. So good luck with that one, Donald. I guess you live in it, buddy. I don't know what to say about that one. So, fourth, and just so you guys know, I know this video is running a little long, but we are almost done here. Begin removing the more than 2 million criminal illegal immigrants from the country and cancel visas to foreign countries that won't take them back. Again, I do have some issues with this. Obviously, we do need to enforce our existing immigration laws. And if someone has committed a legitimate crime while they've been illegally here in this country, that may actually be grounds for deportation, depending on the nature of the crime. But cutting off your nose to spite your face is never a good idea, and cutting off countries as potential allies, or cutting off good diplomatic relations with countries simply because of an immigration issue that the governments of those countries are only peripherally involved in, does not seem to me to be the best use of executive power in this particular instance. I think it really could, especially if Donald Trump approaches it with his typical bulldozer approach, which is simply to complain until he gets his way. I really do think that this could damage our international relations. In some ways, it could also damage our economic international relations. So we do have to consider what the ramifications of these decisions are going to be and his approach to it. There are ways to approach this reasonably, and I hope Donald Trump takes those. I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt at this point because he hasn't done anything yet. He hasn't made any mistakes yet because he isn't president yet. I'm hoping when he is president, he's going to take a much more moderate stance than he has so far during his campaign. I'm hoping the last few days we've seen some moderation on his part in terms of the things that he's now saying now that he is the president-elect. And I really am hoping that that's the path he continues to follow, because if he does, his presidency is not going to be disastrous. It's not the world-ending apocalypse that people on the left are saying. It's not, it's not America reversing everything we've accomplished in the last 50 or 60 years. It's Donald Trump being the president. And if he's a relative moderate, that's not going to be as big a deal as people are making it out to be. Let's say that. And the final point that we are going to hit here is suspend immigration from terror-prone regions where vetting cannot safely occur. All vetting of people coming into our country will be considered extreme vetting. And this has been one of the most controversial issues of the entire campaign. This is one of those things where there are good arguments to be made on both sides. On the side that Donald Trump usually falls on, there is a good national security argument. Are we letting people in who do intend to commit crimes in this country? On the other hand, there is the humanitarian argument on the other side that is equally valid, especially in the case of Syria. We have been partially responsible for a lot of this. So, yeah, this is one of those things that Donald Trump kind of is going to get his way on because he is going to be the president for the next 4 years, and I think we can all pretty well agree that the Syrian situation is going to be wrapped up by the time that he is, out of office. Not so much because of anything he does, but because it is already in the process of wrapping up during the end of the Obama administration. I really do not see the Syrian civil war dragging on, at least in its current form, for another 4 years. I find that fairly hard to believe that it would. I guess what it really boils down to is, what do you consider extreme vetting? Are we talking extreme vetting in terms of, we're going to make sure that we know who people are and where they come from? Or are we talking extreme vetting in the sense that we are going to make it so difficult to obtain entry into the United States that we are effectively cutting off immigration from areas that are, war-torn or terrorist-prone? I think there are a lot of questions left to answer there, and I'm hoping that he's going to give us some answers here soon. So that is Donald Trump's plan, amazingly, for his first day in office. I didn't even get to the legislative stuff. So I'll probably try and do another video on that at some point, kind of go play-by-play as I did on this one. But in the meantime, if you like the content here, if you enjoy political analysis, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. We will be doing a lot more of these. And also, put your thoughts in the comments below. That's the whole reason that we do this channel, that we do the podcast, is we want to actually encourage discourse about the direction of America and about American politics. So please leave your comments below. We do ask that you simply keep it, somewhat courteous if you're going to get into a discussion either with us or with someone else who happens to comment. We do try to promote civil discourse, so keep that in mind. We obviously have no control over that, so you guys do what you want to do. And we will see you later for another episode of the podcast. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.